Hola, students. So this week, hopefully you read the book first. I didn't, usually I'll probably do some longer lectures on here than this one, usually providing a little bit more examples where we can kind of apply those juicy ethical concepts that we'll be discussing. But I found that this week's reading was pretty straightforward. So I have a couple ideas about discussion for class, but I thought rather than regurgitate the material, I'll kind of reference a couple of the important concepts about things you should be thinking about in terms of what it means to be a counselor and the counselor identity. But I thought it could also just be helpful to provide some of my own kind of personal experiences and thoughts since I've been doing this for a while. I realize that some of you are coming to this class from different places. Some of you have done this maybe a few semesters. For some of you, this is your first semester. So hopefully we can in this class meet you where you need to be. And yeah. So let's get started. So first, I'm assuming that you've read the chapters. What do you think of the book? You should let me know. So the counseling identity, what is that? When we hear the term counselor, it's actually a really common term, right? If I think about it, there are camp counselors. I was a camp counselor growing up. There are Bible counselors. There are genetic counselors. So counseling is in some ways in my opinion, I feel it's unfortunate that that's kind of the term we settled on because it's still so generic. So really we just need to do a lot of work to claim that term. So we are counselors. So what is a counselor? In the book they talk about, there used to be this idea because of the history of where we come from as counselors that we provided just simple guidance. Simple relative life issues. We're not going to go too deep into anything. We're not going to do that deep, dark, emotional stuff. But is that really the case? I think hopefully you already know that's not the case. And really, I think earlier, we'll get into the history of counseling more later in the semester, but earlier concepts of counseling did come out of vocational guidance counseling. But even at that time, they were really focused on, solving a quick problem. But even vocational counseling today, we realize that what someone does for their work could be so tied to who they are emotionally or be tied to some experience they had as a child or memory that really, when people need help, there are often a lot of deeper things going on. And counselors are trained to handle the deep, dark, emotional underpinnings of humanity, which is what I love about it. So it's really hard to say what a counselor's scope of practice is. That should be dictated by their education, but also their interests and what they continue to grow into. And some people, when they leave here in NKU, they might end up working with addiction issues. And kind of they might hear a lot of stuff about childhood trauma or other experiences that has led someone to need to cope with drugs and alcohol, for example. Other individuals might be school counselors, and you'll be working with kids, and I know that those school counselors are going to be doing a lot of guidance for their students, but they're also going to have students who just need that extra person there to go to some of the harder things going on at home, etc. So how to define the scope of counseling? There really is a range there, and so we really should be prepared to deal with all kinds of stuff. And I think I'll get into this a little bit more in a bit, but another big kind of question that we're wrestling with right now in this class is at the beginning, like, what are we and how do we compare to psychologists, social workers, etc.? I'll say a bit more about that later, but it is important that you kind of know the difference and also how you think about those differences and how we should work with them. So I'll say more about that in a second, but professional counselor. So what is a professional counselor? There are a lot of different types of professional counselors, but for the most part, we are united under ACA, the American Counseling Association. We usually come from CACREP accredited institutions. That includes mental health counselors, school counselors, college counselors, addiction counselors, as well as couples and family counselors. There are rehabilitation counselors, but they usually go into programs under the accreditation body of CORE, not CACREP. But so you have these people in different settings doing all kinds of different things. But what's really the guiding thread? Counselors. If you've seen all these photos, I'm covering one of them up, aren't I? Can I move the little screen I'm at? Sure, I'll just move it there. counselors talk to people. We know how to work with people. We should know how to work with people. We're trained to really build relationships with people, and that's where we believe good work happens. And as we kind of go along, and we talk about those core conditions that are really huge values of counselors, empathy, congruence, showing us up as our authentic selves, those core conditions are a huge part of what make us a profession. And I think they're also going to show up in the ethics. So as we go through this class and you continue to learn about our codes of ethics, I want you to consider how us being professionals who work intimately with other people, who build relationships with other people, how that shows up in our codes of ethics, because it does a lot. Then quickly, I wanted to just kind of talk about my experiences. So you read this week about what are, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, psych nurses, different types of professionals who do similar work as us. Now, I'm not going to spend my time going into detail right now about the differences between those professions. Hopefully you read that. But I would say that when I went to my master's program, and I liked my instructors a lot, but I think that I was sort of taught that there's this kind of competitiveness, right? So you have all these professions who supposedly do the same thing or very similar things. And it can be really easy for there to be a lot of turf wars. And there have been, actually. There have been different things with the American Psychological Association trying to keep counselors out of being involved in writing the DSM, et cetera, different land wars between social work and counseling. And I just want to encourage you at the start of your career, this is just my opinion, to maybe have a slightly more open attitude towards other types of mental health professionals. First of all, I think it's great if counselors set that standard for being, open and collaborative, but also the training in each of these professions is different. Social workers, some of them are really fine counselors, but most of their training is not as dedicated to individual counseling like ours is. So I do think that we are trained better to do individual counseling. But social workers know a ton about resources. They tend to know more about kind of government institutions that are available to help people or different kind of programs or resources. Psychologists. There aren't as many practicing psychologists or counseling psychologists these days, but they do exist. I haven't actually ever worked with those individuals, but I think they're a little bit rarer these days. But psychiatrists, psychiatrists prescribe medicine. A lot of them are not amazing with interpersonal skills. I've met several, and they tend to work with a client for 15 minutes, diagnose them. They're focused on finding that diagnosis and getting the meds and out the door. I have met some that are really amazing at working with clients, but still their primary training is understanding the brain, understanding mental health disorders as disorders through the medical model. And I worked very closely with a nursing, a psychiatric nurse and a psychiatrist with one of my clients at a place I was at before I came here. I had a client who was schizophrenic, one of my favorite clients. But instead of working against each other, we worked together. We met every few months to talk about, so how are his symptoms showing up? Is the medication helping to deal with that? The nursing psychiatrist, the psychiatric nurse and the psychiatrist would ask me, has he talked about the meds? But I was also able to provide them information about, through our relationship that I built with the client, I was able to learn about his childhood trauma, his childhood abuse. I was able to get more information than them about what are the voices he heard, what were the voices saying, and I could create more context for his medical care, and they could also create more context for me in understanding some of the more biological issues coming up for him as a result of his issue. So, and I also worked with the social worker where I was. I worked in what I would call an integrated care facility, and I really think of that as the future of counseling, of working with other professionals. If I know the social workers and I have a good relationship with them, I'm going to be able to connect my clients to better resources. If I'm able to work with psychiatrists, I'm able to make sure that they're on the right meds. I'm able to give them more information. They're able to give me information. And that's also in a fairy tale land where everyone gets to work at a place like that, where there are those types of working relationships. But I do think that the best client care comes when different health professionals work together. So I think it's also important as a counselor that you know what you offer the world of mental health that's unique, that is powerful, because we are, I think, the best at building that relationship, creating that support, helping walk with people through their emotional experiences, through their cognitive frameworks, and helping them hopefully see those things differently or shift them over time. We put the time in. So we have something to offer, and I think it's valuable. And I think what other professionals have to offer is valuable. So that's just my little encouragement for you. So lastly, another thing is that I'm wondering, before you read this chapter, did you know how to speak to those differences between social work, the different kind of health professionals and counselors, mental health professionals? Can you still? So it can be hard for us to even know the difference. More importantly, another thing I want you to think about, does the community know the difference? I've been a counselor doing counseling for 6 years now, and people will ask me questions about counseling all the time. They'll be like, are you a psychologist? What are you? It can be pretty confusing. So I think something that I was told to do when I was a fresh counseling student was, what is my elevator speech for how I describe what a counselor is? So it's not only important that you know why counseling is beneficial and why your profession has something unique to offer, but can you put that into words? Can you tell your brother, your sister, your friend, your coworker, what makes counseling counseling? What are the benefits of counseling? How is it different from seeing a psychiatrist? How is it different from, going to your doctor and saying that you're depressed and him just writing you a script? Side note, it's sad that general medical doctors give out that medicine because they don't know it. But, what do counselors do? So we'll probably do an activity about this in class this week. So I want you to start thinking about, what would your elevator speech to someone about explaining what a counselor is be? So an elevator speech is usually just like a quick 1-2 minute speech of describing something. So these are general guidelines I found online. Who do you work with? What do you deliver? How do you do it? What you do, what's the benefit of what you do, and, who are you? So for you, just start thinking about that. If you were to provide a quick explanation to someone, if they asked, what is a counselor? How is it different from other types of mental health professionals? What can counseling do for me? What would you say? Because I think that you'll find that you are also an advocate for our community of counselors. And it's a confusing world out there. I recently had to help my sister find a counselor for my niece, and even trying to help her, it's a confusing world. Mental health is disorganized in our hospital systems. It's just kind of a mess. So we need people who can speak to what we do, to let our communities know what we do. Also, long-term advocacy efforts to get us in hospitals, to organize the mental health system. I don't know if I'm even making sense at this point, but takeaways. What do you really think the counseling identity is? Can you put that into words? What does make us special? What does make us different? That'll be all. We'll do more in class this week. Make sure that you watch the other video that I'm going to post that is not by me, and take the quiz. See you soon.